Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
His Excellency, the Rektor of Islamic University of Indonesia, Professor Fathul Wahid, S.T, M.Sc, Ph.D, Honorable the Chair of Islamic Law Study, Doctoral Program, Faculty of Islamic Studies, Doktor, Yusdani, M.Ag, Respectable the Chair of Islamic Studies, Master Program, Faculty of Islamic Studies, Doktor Junanah, M.S. The Honorable, our guest speaker, Professor Imam Sejad, M.A, Ph.D, S.Ag, Successor University Researcher, Honorable Professor Faisal, M.A, Ph.D, as speaker. The Honorable, all lecturers of Faculty Islamic Studies, Islamic University of Indonesia. Respectable all participants of this seminar today. Ladies and gentlemen, firstly, let's thank to the Almighty Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala who has given us some mercies and blessing, so we can attend this seminar without any troubles and obstacles. Secondly, salawat and salam may always be given to our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who has guided us from the darkness to the lightness, from the stupidity to the cleverness, namely Islam religion. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tias Prayasti, your master ceremony today. Welcome to Studium General. Dear audiences, ladies and gentlemen, to start our event today, allow me to read several agendas. The first agenda is opening. The second is opening ceremony from Rektor of Islamic University of Indonesia. The third is the core of seminar about dynamic of Islamic thought. Fourth is closing statement, and the last agenda is closing. Those are the today agenda, which will be presented soon. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's open this event by saying Basmalah together. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much. Dear audiences, moving on the second agenda, which was the opening ceremony from Rektor of Islamic University of Indonesia, Professor Fathul Wahid, S.T, M.Sc, Ph.D. To Mr. Fathul Wahid, time and place are yours.
Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
A very good afternoon from Indonesia to all the participants. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillahil akram, alladzi 'allama bil qalam, 'allama al insana ma lam ya'lam. Wassalatu wassalamu ala nabiyyina Muhammadin khatamil anbiya wal mursalin khairil anam wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum ila yaumil qiyamati 'ala dawam alladzina al-kiram. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. The honorable invited speakers, Professor Sejad, M.Phil, Ph.D., the principal Imam of Cambridge Central Mosque, who is also the research fellow at the University of Exeter, Professor Dr. Faisal Ismail M.A. from Universitas Islam Indonesia, the Dean and the Vice Deans of the Faculty of Islamic Studies, the Head of Department, the Head of Study Program, the professors and faculty members, the students of the Master's and Doctorate Program at the Faculty of Islamic Studies, and all the participants. First of all, please allow me to welcome the new Master and Doctorate students 2021 cohort as new members of the big family of Universitas Islam Indonesia, UII. As some of you may already know, UII is among the pioneers of higher learning in Indonesia, which was established by the founding fathers of Indonesia, even before the independence of Indonesia in 1945. And today, UII is a home for around 28,000 students coming from all corners of Indonesia and overseas. Second of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to Professor Sejad and Professor Faisal Ismail for accepting our invitation to share perspectives of the dynamics of Islamic thought with special reference to the two contexts, the Balkans Peninsula, or more specifically Bosnia and Indonesia. Professor Mekik will share insight emanated by Hosein Dozo, a Muslim reformist from former communist Yugoslavia, while Professor Ismail will discuss the development of Islamic thought in contemporary Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, before proceeding with the opening remark, I have to confess that my formal educational background have nothing to do with the area of concern that will be discussed today. But I would like to invite all Muslim academics to pay attention to the discourse of Islamic thought or Islamic thinking, at least to some extent, or of course, more preferably, or is possible to a great extent. I would like to share with you 2 points in this short remark. And the first one is about developing genuine mutual understanding among various Islamic thought. I do believe that our involvement in such a discussion will equip us with vocabularies which are very important to cultivate our mutual understanding as a necessary condition to create what I call collective awareness fruitfully and to contribute to the progress of Islamic civilization meaningfully. I would like to emphasize here that mutual understanding is not always easy to be established. Among the reasons is the variety of the departing point of views of the Islamic scholars and the future of Islam they imagine. I myself is among those who believe that two things that are different are not always diametrically opposed or even annihilate one to each other or competing with one another. But in many cases, they are completing or enriching to each other. In this sense, I tend to argue that when discussing the various Islamic thoughts, we are like a scientist who consider that each of the proposed perspective is true methodologically. The truth is subjective, proven, and not absolute. But often, on the ground, in reality, we act as theologians who preach an absolute truth without opening room for debate or discussion, using a binary perspective, true or false, one or null, white or black. This way of thinking for sure is valid for certain issues. For example, Tawhid, believing in the existence of God. But in many other cases, there is a gradation. Hence, I would like to invite you to join me, if you agree. The idea of having imaginary corridor is relevant to provide an environment of mutual respect, where each of diverse Islamic thought has a room for development. Please correct me if I might be wrong. The energy-consuming conflict that happens between Muslim groups are quite often triggered by this unconscious standpoint. For sure, this perspective is open for further meaningful discussion. That's the first point. The second point I would like to share is about answering the four-word question. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is constantly changing. Each time has its own problem and demand for relevant solution. Islam should be part of the solution to contemporary problem. For sure, this perspective does not imply that we have no fixed standpoint. My point is that how we can transform the spirit of Tawheed, our full submission to the God, to Allah, as fuel for progression. I believe that all the Islamic thought should have this spirit as the starting point. But the perspectives emerge from studying the sacred text, Al-Quran, Al-Hadith, should be reflected in Islamic collective activism, collective action that bring blessing to mankind or universe, rahmatan lil alamin. Equally important here is that we may learn from the rich Islamic thought developed by the past Muslim scholars and contextualize it in the contemporary times. Here, the principle al-muhafadatul al-qadim salih wal akhdhu bil jadidil aslah is still valid, still hold. If we do agree on this, then designing collective futures in plural form, futures, is a must. We have to be proactive, otherwise others will design our future, which probably does not align with our imagination or interest. This reminds me to a note made by Ziauddin Sardar in one of his writings. He wrote, the shortcoming of the past century in Islamic world has been the inability of Muslims to appreciate their own strengths, comprehend the reality of the contemporary world, and adjust to rapid changes. The Muslim has been forced to react to one challenge to another, moving from one cul-de-sac to another, reacting. The way forward, and it seemed to Sardar to be the only rational way ahead, is for Muslims to become proactive, shape the future with foresight and a genuine appreciation of their present predicament, truthful assessment of the historic shortcomings, and a deep understanding of contemporary global reality. In sum, the ultimate goal that we have in mind in rejuvenating or contextualizing Islamic thought should be for a brighter future Islam, to prove that Islam is a religion that suits for all times and all mankind. They should be meaningful and useful as a springboard to build a new Islamic civilization. I hope that I do not bring utopian thinking here, and I have to stop here and let discussion begin and flow. I believe that all the participants will find the discussion enjoyable personally and rewarding academically, inshallah. I thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi
wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much for Mr. Fathul Wahid, S.P., M.Sc, Ph.D. for the opening ceremony. Now we continue to the main event for our studium general today. To lead the next session, I would like to invite Mr. Supriyanto Abdi, S.Ag M.CAA, as Lecturer of Faculty Islamic Studies, to moderate the seminar today. To Mr. Abdi, please welcome.
Thank you very much, Tias. Dear participants, audience, honorable guests, and distinguished speakers, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Good afternoon for all of you in Indonesia and neighboring areas, and good morning to our distinguished speaker, Professor Sejad. I understand the time difference between Indonesia and England. So we are very happy that you would like to share your time to start your day early in the beginning today. Right. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Dear participant, audience, my dear sisters and brothers, we are very fortunate today to have this kind of important event. And we are very grateful that our distinguished speaker would like to share his time with us today. So as a moderator, I would like to first introduce or set a kind of setting for our discussion today. So the topic of our event today is very important. This study in general and this webinar will be talking about the dynamic of Islamic thought with some kind of comparative perspectives, comparing the European context, especially Balkan context and Indonesian context. And for this purpose, we have two distinguished speakers. The first one, I would like to introduce Professor Sejad M.Ag. My sincere apologies, Professor, if I don't pronounce your name properly.
It was perfect.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. So let me just briefly introduce Professor Dr. Sejad M.Ag. He, as Rektor mentioned before, he is the Imam of Cambridge Central Mosque. I think it's quite new mosque in England, and he's been serving as one of the imams in this mosque. And I also can mention several academic journey that our professor has gone through. So our professor has studied in the very early stage at the L.C. Ibrahim Pasha Madrasah. Again, my sincere apology if I didn't pronounce the names.
No, it was good.
Yeah, and then our professor completed his BA in Islamic Studies at the University of Wales, and then his MPhil at the University of Cambridge in England, and his PhD in School of Oriental and African Studies in London, if I'm not mistaken. So So from this, academic record, I'm very sure that our professor is a very qualified expert to talk about our topic today. And just to mention, he completed his PhD in SOAS. Writing a dissertation is very important dissertation, which will be, I think the basic of our discussion today. So Dr. M.Ag wrote the life and thought of Hosein Dozo, one of the prominent Balkan scholar, and we'll be discussing a little bit more about his thought, and we'll be excited to hear more about him from Dr. M.Ag. And then after Dr. M.Ag, we'll have another speaker, our own professor, Professor Fathul Ismail, who will be speaking the same theme, the dynamic Islamic thought, but in the context of Indonesia. So again, I think just to provide some kind of background and context, our topic is very timely and very important, and just some kind of introductory note. This kind of comparative perspective is very useful for us, and especially for new students of the master and doctoral program in our faculty of Islamic Studies. I would say that maybe some of us are not really familiar with Hosein Dozo, for example, or Muslim thinkers in European context. And this kind of opportunity, discussion and lecture on some of the contemporary Muslim scholars in European context will be very important for us. Despite the fact that we have some differences, but also have some commonalities. I could say that, for example, geographically and culturally, historically, Balkan region is quite different from our region, Southeast Asia, for example, in terms of geographical, context, historical, cultural context, and also political context. Dr. Mekic brought his dissertation on the Hosein Dozo in the context of communist Balkan, country at the time, and we as a nation, as a country, even though we also have some encounters with communist ideas and movement, but communism was politically and politically undermined for a long time in our country. So those are some kind of differences in terms of geographical, historical, and political context. But at the same time, we do have some important commonalities, I think, and this is very important basis for our discussion. Hosein Dozo, for example, based on my limited understanding, and we would like to hear more from Dr. Mekic. He introduced his ideas and thought on how to interpret Quran, for example, how to develop fatwas in the context of multi-religious society, in the context of multicultural society. And those contexts are exactly the context that we're also facing here in Indonesia. So I think discussing, the thought and ideas of Muslim scholars in the European context, especially in the Balkan context, as represented by Hosein Dozo, for example, I think it's very useful for us as well in terms of it could provide as well some kind of insights on how we develop our understanding of religion, of the Quran, of Islamic law in the context of multicultural and multi-religious societies. So I think that is very much important. That's a very important point to start off. So again, so this is just general context for our discussion. Hopefully, it lays some grounds for our purposeful discussion. But I think without further ado, I would like to invite first our distinguished speaker, Professor Sejad Mekic, to deliver his insight, his thought on this very important topic. As you know, that this is our session that will be divided into main session. So first we have a speech from the both speakers, and then we will allocate some time in the end for Q&A. So I would like to it for approximately 45 minutes for Dr. Mekic. So time is fully yours, Professor.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillahi wa ba'd. Your Excellencies, Your Eminencies, respected professors, the President of the University, the Director, the Head of your department, of your Faculty of Islamic Studies, my colleagues, my beloved brothers and sisters, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. It is an honor indeed to be sharing some of the findings and cultural dimension as well as intellectual dimension of our Balkan history. And I maybe will agree that we might be quite ignorant about each other's cultures and histories, but there's too much in common basically to ignore one aspect or dimension of these recent developments in Islamic studies. In fact, you'll be very surprised if I were to tell you, when I was conducting my research, PhD research about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I was always admiring the reformist movement of Indonesian scholars in 50s and 60s and onwards. And I found some parallels between Hosein Dozo and some of your local scholars, but because of the scope of my own PhD and dissertation, I just had to focus on the Balkans and his own teachers, who are the famous Egyptian modernists and reformists. But I found some really noble studies published by Oxford University Press and others that really showed me Muslims, wherever they happen to be, they have no other choice but to develop their Islamic legal system and live up to the times. So in each corner of the Islamic world, in other words, there must be always some kind of mujtahids and muftis like Hosein Dozo and the ones that we know in your continent. So as you can see, the title of my paper today is Dynamics of Islamic Thought in the Balkan region, in the Balkans. And I would like to examine or analyze the modernist and reformist thought of Hosein Dozo, who was really a prominent Bosnian Muslim scholar. As you can see, he was born in 1912 and he died in 1982. That was a time when the external challenges to the Muslim world were so many, and its internal problems became really complicated, complex and overwhelming, like very few people would be able to take a stance. And like our president said earlier on, instead of talking about ideas, let us live Islam. So Dozo really wanted to achieve that in his writings, in his academic life, but also on a practical level. In other words, Dozo really made it his goal, the aim of his life, to reinterpret the teachings of Islam, especially in the Balkan region, in former Yugoslavia, communist Yugoslavia, to a generation, a complete generation, if not 2 generations of Muslims in Yugoslavia, for whom the truths and realities of our religion, of the religion of Islam, had fallen into disuse, like they detached, they disconnected basically from the beautiful teachings of Islam. They stopped living Islam. You know, they were not even studying Islam as an academic discipline, studying about Islam. So he realized there are 2 mistakes and 2 problems here. One is we need to improve the level of studying about Islam, its notions and principles and teachings. And the second one is we have to somehow explain the primary sources of this religion of Islam and make it pragmatic and practical, useful to the Muslims of our modern societies. So this is a heavily study on Islam and modernity, or the challenges of modernity. So Dozo, in this sense, as my colleague mentioned, represents a rare, a unique but precious example of a Muslim scholar from the Balkan region, if not from other parts of the Muslim world. There were not many really who responded to the challenges of modernity in this way at that time. You know, at the end of the last century, as I mentioned, in 60s and 70s is the time when Dozo produced most of his scholarly works. So he basically is a very good and precious example of a Muslim scholar, especially from the Balkan region, but elsewhere as well, from the Middle East and the Far East and the Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, who recognized the impact of modernity on religious traditionalism. So he realized this notion of modernity, the new phenomenon, is really something that is challenging our tradition. Islam is a very traditional religion, and we Muslims are traditionalists in that sense. So what he did was, he attempted with his scholarly efforts to meet the new intellectual challenge of modernity and present Islam in the language of his time. So he did so, he dealt with it in a rather amazing way, extensively in his works, in his publications, which were several hundreds, but also in his public life, in his professional life. And obviously, we can say, being a Muslim, a sincere Muslim, he did so in his private life too. At every instance, Dozo promoted the right to free thinking and encouraged a critical research into religious sources and texts. He believed, for sure, that Islam is preeminently a religion of reason. You will see that on one of the codes in the presentation that I'm sharing with you. I don't know if you can you see my presentation on? Okay.
Yes.
Yes, we can see, bro.
Okay. I can see. Thank you.
So basically, like I said, at every instance, he promoted the right to free thinking, and he encouraged the critical research into religious sources and texts. Why? Because he believed that Islam is a religion of reason, and he sought very much to demystify the main Islamic disciplines of tafsir, of fiqh and aqidah, and to make them accessible to modern men. But his approach in doing this was twofold. First, turning back to the original sources of Sharia, which is the Holy Quran and the Sunnah, in order to determine the essential message, according to him, of Islam, like the main notions and principles, usul, and so on. And then turning towards the contemporary situation in order to establish the appropriate interpretation, the best interpretation, as well as application of scriptural precepts to particular cases and conditions. So it's not just to figure out theoretically what is the best Islam and what are the best principles that we need to adhere to in nowadays, but also apply them in a particular socio-political context. Print, of course, was a primary, you can argue, means for Dozo in communicating his modernist and reformist ideas. This is in both ways. Within academic circles, let's say professors or students of Islamic studies or knowledge, but also to the wider public or community. And this includes, like my colleague respectfully said, believe me or not, non-Muslims, even communists, people who didn't really believe in any religious kind of notion, didn't believe in God. So he was writing for them, and he was writing for the Roman Catholic Christians in Bosnia or in former Yugoslavia, and Orthodox Christians in Yugoslavia, and a small Jewish community that is found there, as well as Gypsies, Romas, and other backgrounds, but they are really a tiny minority in comparison to the Muslim community in the Balkans and the Christian community in the Balkans. But the predominant force, if you would like to say, of forced secularization and atheism, forceful form of communism or atheism that was prevalent in the country where he was born and grew and worked. So he wrote over 250 titles to his name. So this really tells us that he was a prolific writer. He was a gifted writer. In his writings, he covered a wide spectrum of subjects, and not everybody will be able to do this. All vindicating the position of Islam by discussing the matter, not merely from an ethical and spiritual viewpoint, but also from an educational and sociological angle, appropriate to the subject matter on which he was focusing. Out of his many, many publications, his efforts in the fields of tafsir, okay? Tafsir or ulum al-Quran, you can say the Quranic sciences or the Quranic exegesis, and in the field of Islamic law and jurisprudence, al-fiqh wa usuluhu, are the most significant of all. For example, Dozo's translation and commentary of the Quran marked a new way of understanding and interpreting the message of the Quran in the Balkan lands. He was the first person to properly write a tafsir or begin writing a tafsir in Bosnian, native Bosnian language, from his own insha, in his own way, similar to Muhammad Abduhu and other Muslim reformists like Rashid Rida and Mahmoud Shatut and Mustafa al-Maraghi, who were basically his teachers at Al-Azhar University. So he was the first person to do this in the field of tafsir, and so the first field in what we call positive Islamic law, fiqh, but especially the institution of fatwa giving. The very first mufti who could basically write fatwas that were so sophisticated and long, some of them like essays and academic papers, in his native language, using primary sources, not translating them and borrowing translations from someone else, but he himself understanding the verses from the Quran and the hadith of our beloved Prophet ﷺ, and similarly tafsir from classical periods into the Middle Ages period and the modern tafsir literature, and the same is with Islamic law literature and ethics and aqidah and all of that. So it was a really new thing, a really refreshing and you can say a new level of authority when it comes to Islamic scholarship in a native language in a very unique and difficult socio-political context where Dozo found himself. So it marked a new way. He saw in the Quran, Dozo saw in the Quran the fundamentals of Islam and of Islamic doctrine for the human being, primarily, as your respected president said earlier on, as the human being, as a servant of God, Abdullah. So he started writing about this notion We are primarily ibadullah, servants of Allah. In a communist, you can't think about it, an atheist, environment. This is really amazing. How do you challenge Marxism that was so prevalent and powerful at that time in this particular way? But he did so in a very respectful way, which fostered personal agency, freedom, harmony, and also social justice. Because you know that communism is all to do with Marxism and socialism. So he always tried to bring forth those beautiful ideas of our religion, like adl and qist, and taking care of orphan and this and that. So basically, he wrote quite a lot, you can say, under the general area or notion of social justice, which of course is applicable in today's England and Germany and the United States of America and Argentina and Indonesia and Malaysia and Japan and China and Russia and everywhere in the world, basically. However, the cornerstone of Dozo's his epistemology, if you were to ask me that, and his legal methodology, manhajuhu fil aqida, manhajuhu fil usul aw fil fiqh aw manhajuhu fil tafsir, really comes out in his discussions on the concept of ijtihad. It's all about legal reasoning. How do you analyze and study the primary text, the sources, the Quran and the Hadith, and whatever emanates from it as secondary, you can say, sources. So it's really about doing ijtihad. Yeah, doing ijtihad and finding new solutions for his fellow Muslims, of course for himself, but not only in the Balkans. And I agree with my colleague who spoke just before me. These things are helpful, whichever mujtahid arises in the Muslim world, in whichever country or continent. If they did actual proper ijtihad, especially if it's at the highest level, you all know there are different degrees of doing ijtihad, even ijtihad in a madhab, because in Bosnia we follow Hanafi madhab. Let's say in Indonesia, it's a big country, so many islands, but let's say predominantly Shafi'i. If you had a top mujtahid in Shafi'i school of thought, in madhab, I'm sure all the Shafi'is in Egypt, even though Imam Shafi himself had those two schools, would benefit, no doubt. And this is how I actually see it. So exposing Dozo and this, let's say, aspect of our intellectual history of the Balkans is certainly, no doubt, useful for Muslims elsewhere. So is your intellectual and cultural history and scholarly efforts by Muslim scholars from the last century and this moment in time really useful for us in the Balkans. So according to Dozo, he assumed the practice of ijtihad actually to be the principal means for reviving Islam, especially Islamic law, al-fiqh, and adapting it to the needs of the contemporary society. And this is through fatwas, basically. Yeah, issuing new fatwas. To be honest with you, a couple of months ago, or less than that, we had the major conference as well. I attended the major conference and gave a paper on greening mosques, because as my colleague mentioned, I am a principal imam at the Cambridge Central Mosque, and I'm affiliated to several universities and academic institutions too, because I'm an academic too. However, when I saw my colleagues, big professors and people who are in charge of your Ministry of Religious Affairs in Indonesia, and what they have actually now done for the institution of fatwa, and how you have issued 4 or 5 fatwas whereby you protect the environment, I almost was emotional, crying, because I know when I was studying Dozo for the last 20 years, I've been dealing with Dozo for the last 20 years. You won't believe me, but that's true. I always said, I wish there is a country which will take this institution of fatwa very seriously and make kind of fatwas which are like laws. And this is what you have achieved in Indonesia. And I really congratulate you on this. And the last 4 or 5 fatwas that I have read, and this is basically a very short field that I focus on, which is studying fatwas and analyzing fatawas, I was utterly impressed with the way that the Ministry of Religious Affairs in Indonesia issued the fatwas, held councils of your major scholars, prominent scholars, made the fatwas, then made them accessible to the imams, and in a way coordinated everything and centralized it so that everything is published in leaflets and books, in Indonesian language, in English language, in Arabic. And now everyone is aware of those things. And they are so central and so critical, especially for you guys over there. And I do sympathize for you because you are seeing the real climate change. We are yet maybe to see what is happening over there. So basically what I'm trying to say is that it's paramount to find a way to arrive at a very proper, let's say, good conclusion, useful conclusion, then approve it, verify it, give it very much authority, the biggest authority that we can. So I'm sure, like in Bosnia, the Islamic community of Bosnia, or let's say the Ministry of Religious Affairs, it's supposed to be the strongest institution or ministry out of all ministries, because all Muslims of Indonesia feel part of it, a member of it. So if the Grand Mufti of Indonesia authorizes something, and the Council of Muftis in Indonesia and in Bosnia, or the Balkans and in Egypt likewise, and then they say, you must do this, you must not, cut the trees and waste water and so on and so forth, it becomes the new ethics, the new norm, okay, in the awareness of the layman. And this is basically what Joseph was trying to do, but on an individual capacity. Whereas in Indonesia, you have managed to achieve that, I would say, at an institutionalized level, which is to me now a new precedent, a new example for other Muslim countries like Morocco, especially, and Egypt and Syria and other Muslim countries, especially Muslim majority countries, to follow. I'm not exaggerating, honestly. I was absolutely the circumstances of our motive is what I define Islamic modernism, or let's say I define it as Islamic modernist and reformist thought. In fact, I do call it Islamic modernism in a mild, moderate way, or Islamic reformism. But you can actually say it Islamic reformist and modernist thought. Okay, so Joseph was arguably the most prominent and important, okay, proponent of Islamic modernist and reformist thought in the second half of the 20th century in the Balkans, all Balkans, arguably in Europe. As a Muslim scholar who lived in a European, secular, multi-religious and multicultural society, Joseph and his work present us with a particularly exciting and dynamic case, okay, through which to examine the innovative and reformative interpretations of Islam. We can't keep relying on Shafi and Abu Hanifa anymore, and Ghazali, and I don't know, any other classical Muslim jurist or theologian, including Ibn Taymiyyah, any one of them. Basically, we have to come up with a strategy, or the Muslim scholars have to come up with a strategy to find new ways and basically move on and deal with the nawazil, with the new issues that we constantly keep facing, like the COVID-19 is another challenge that we have now, but to me is the climate change, or Islam al-Walbiyah, Islam and the environment. How do we protect the environment from a moral and ethical perspective, and theological as well? We need to start talking about green faith. Okay, green faith, environmental sustainability, and so on. So these are huge issues and challenges, global issues and challenges that I believe fully our Muslim jurists primarily, and then Muslim theologians secondary, could actually raise awareness and save or do something to provide us enough projects and techniques and tools so that we begin preserving and saving and looking after the environment rather than ruining it. So I'm talking about very practical issues here, basically. So it's innovative and reformist interpretation of Islam, but it's very pragmatic at the same time. It's practical. Moreover, in Joseph's scholarly work, or let's say heritage, in his scholarly work, we are presented by a very special and unique example for the academic, for the researcher, and layman as well alike, yeah, any one of those. To analyze what? To analyze so-called European Islam, if you want to call it a European Islam, or what does it mean to be a Muslim in Europe? And you know, I'm living in England now. I came to study my PhD, as you heard, I studied my MPhil at Cambridge University, Divinity of Faculty of Divinity, and my PhD at the University of London, SOAS. So there are so many Muslims, many more than Bosnia, for example, living here in UK, and the same is in Germany, in Italy, not to mention some other countries which have like really significant number of Muslims living. So this notion of European Islam is a big one. It's a very challenging one, and most Muslims are losing their identity and they're assimilating in modernist and secularist environments where they find themselves. Why? Because there are no muftis who can live in reality in England and Germany and Italy, or in the rest of Europe or the West, in the United States or Canada or Australia. They keep bringing the notions from Pakistan or Afghanistan or even the Balkans or Turkey, and they are just basically going around and round in their own bubble. And this is, to me, a very big problem. So part of the reasons why I took an imam's position is to basically try to raise awareness among my imam colleagues and people who practice Islam and preach Islam to the layman, basically to start approaching everything with a critical eye. You know, let's stop ignoring, let's always consider our heritage and tradition. I'm a traditionalist myself, but we cannot rely on Fatawa al-Amjiri all the time, or al-Hidayah of al-Marghinani in Hanafi fiqh, for example, and use the fatwas of medieval Muslim jurists. Or just Ibn Baz has so many fatwas, I'm just going to use those. No, I totally disagree with that. And we must have top muftis at all ages. So that's why this shift of the notion of fatwas that was introduced by Yusuf al-Qardawi, in my opinion, very prominently, and other scholars like Mustafa Zarqa, are really important to pay attention to, like Mufti Taqi Uthmani, in my opinion, as well, and some other younger, very younger Muslim muftis that I am aware of, mainly here in UK, who are of the Indian or subcontinent background or origin, but they're doing a wonderful job. Because I have no knowledge of your region, but I'm sure you have some very top muftis as well, young, dynamic, proactive, and scholarly muftis in Indonesia and the whole region, Asia, or especially Southeast Asia, who are able to narrate anything from our Islam and produce an adequate fatwa, a top draw, let's say, fatwa in your local language that will relate to everyone. It's not outdated, but it's actually providing practical solutions to the Ministry of Forestry, to the Ministry of Education, to the Ministry of Engineering, to the Ministry of Transport, to the Ministry of the Environment, and everything. You know, so this is basically what we need, and it's time that we stop being shy or suffering from the inferiority complex, us Muslims who are minorities living in a non-Muslim majority countries, whereas for you is the total opposite. In my opinion, it's unacceptable in Turkey and Egypt and Indonesia and Morocco, let's say, that you don't find solutions because you are a Muslim majority country. Who is challenging you there? What is the problem? You can't be suffering from any inferiority complex, and all your universities are basically headed by Muslims. Every single department, Islamic studies, economics, science, biology, genetics, everything, absolutely everything. So where is the excuse? I don't think so there is one. So we need to consult one another, like we said, this multidisciplinary approach to Islam as a religion that we live and like. And in that way, of course, we will always arrive at best solutions and best answers. But the key premise that we all trust unanimously, a Muslim in the East and the West, across the countries and the globe, is the Holy Quran, the divine revelations. Okay, the primary Islamic sources. No one can question the Quran and the Hadith. Anything else may be questioned and should perhaps be. So, since Dozo's writings in general and his fatwas in particular have continued to be published in the Balkans, in the Balkan lands up to this day, up to the present, like a couple of years, another new selections of his fatwas were published. And even me, when I read them again, after reading them 20 years ago very thoroughly, I still find them refreshing, as if he wrote them last week, for today's challenges of environment and almost COVID issues as well. That's how forward-looking he was. it is hoped that this paper should shed some light on certain assumptions underlying contemporary Islamic thought in the Balkans. So now I'll shift right to the end of my, please tell me how much time is left for my lecture, because I don't have a watch here, to the end of my paper, more or less, just to share one fatwa with you and analyze it so that you can see how did he actually achieve what I'm talking about. The remarkable socio-political circumstances surrounding Jozo's activities influenced his Islamic thought and legal opinions. For example, in his fatwas and in his tafsir, Quranic commentaries, Jozo advocated a sensible understanding of ritual practices, ibadat, that could complement rather than annoy a more modern lifestyle. What I liked by one famous Muslim psychologist, Dr. Abdullah Rahman, he said to me recently, a couple of days ago in our mosque, we take let's say the main ibadah in our religion, salah, the 5 daily prayers. We are so doing it mechanically, it's basically becoming a transaction, mu'amala. It's transactional. We are just praying, we get some benefits spiritually and so forth, but an institution like prayer is supposed to be transformational. The same is with fasting. Those things are supposed to be transformational, changes within, and then that should mirror on our family members and our neighbors and our society at large. That's what Jozo was basically trying to do himself. And to me, that's the most sincere version of Islam. It's the purest, highest and most spiritual. So basically, Jozo was like that, and he was not shy of that. Living in a communist country, he lived his Islam, and he thought is the most dignified and like the most liberating in today's time and all the challenges of modernity and the confusion and the technology. It was the best thing ever, he would say, that we practice our religion, and that will complement, not be in the way of our modern lifestyle. So, in other words, I'm trying to say there was never any dichotomy between religion and science. There never will be any clash between our religion and its, let's say, Sharia, Islamic legal system, and the contemporary or modern technological advancements, if you will. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. Moreover, in his fatwas, Jozo always aimed at ease, yusr, delicacy, attention, detail, and moderation, tawassut, as if these represented the chief characteristics and traits of Islamic tradition or thought. Although Jozo interacted directly with state officials, nothing could suggest that he was one of their people. So he was not a politician, he was a political prisoner, by the way. You can read my book about him. It's a monograph, or you can read my dissertation or some articles that I've published in different edited volumes or academic journals. A very interesting biography, just the biographical side to his, it's so interesting, you know, this notion that traditional Islamic society for 500 years, modernized heavily by the Austro-Hungarian times arrival, and then Jozo in the midst of a communist Yugoslavia, but he is defending everything and challenging the politicians, challenging the president of Yugoslavia, the prime minister, and so on and so forth in his writings, and saying that there is nothing wrong with Islam when it comes to democracy, freedom of this expression, freedom of, you know, speech, basic human rights, basically. So he did very excellent, because he spread his roots, we can say, everywhere. So he's affected people in all segments of contemporary life, and his students basically are the main driving force now in Bosnia and the rest of the Balkans, to be honest with you, in Austria as well, and Germany, because there are too many Bosnians in those two countries, but in particular, they are our very neighboring countries. I give you one more example how Jozo was very up to time, and then I'll go to the fatwa on zakat. So basically, there was nothing to suggest that he was working as a spy or on behalf of the government to ruin Islam. I'm just trying to say he was sincere. It's on the contrary, quite the contrary. It is well documented, and I know that best than anyone else, that his activities were under constant supervision by the communist secret police. He was constantly interrogated and arrested and being questioned. Are you being political now? You know, like, basically now we have that notion Islamism. So he was always accused of Islamism. That's why the first president of Bosnia, Ali Izetbegović, was arrested. But he was a good friend of Dozo, and Dozo was the one who led him into what he believed and the book that he wrote, Islam Between the East and the West. I'm really telling you, the brain, the main mindset behind that amazing book, Islam Between the East and the West, is Hosein Dozo. Let's not fool ourselves here. So Dozo was a scholar, but I'm not belittling Ali Izetbegović by any means. He was a philosopher and a top historian, but Dozo was a proper Muslim theologian and jurist, scholar, who basically knew what needs to be written, like Al-Mawardi, basically, like Ahkam Sultaniyya. Dozo was at that level. Many of Dozo's works are either influenced by, or they seek to influence the socio-political environment of his time. That's how good it was. For example, listen to this example, please. Following the discovery of IVF, you know IVF, for people who can't have babies, children, fertilization, IVF in 1978, where was the first baby born? IVF, in England, in Manchester. This is 1978. Dozo will die 4 years later. He published an essay, very long essay, wherein he elaborated on the legal and ethical, legal and ethical sides of the issue from what? An Islamic perspective, like Mahmoud Sheltut did. Mahmoud Sheltut also wrote about this topic in his time, and there were other scholars later on. But believe me, I believe Dozo was the very first of all Muslim scholars anywhere in the world to respond to this novelty, to this new thing, IVF. Tube, you can have a baby in a tube. So he was basically at that level, and there are many Christian scholars who wrote about this from their own angle, and I could see the parallels. But in Islamic law, we have very clear way to analyze this. So Dozo got the right, he got the balance, he got the right balance, I would say, in the way he tackled this issue and gave us his perspective, which was, in my opinion, a very moderate and good Islamic perspective on this issue. And it's still an issue to deal with, to be honest with you. So in many of his works, one can detect a strong emphasis on the preservation of cultural and historical traditions of the Balkan Muslims. And besides certain elements crucial to the construction of a Bosnian Muslim national identity are also highlighted in several of his works, especially those that were published in Preporod that he actually established. He founded with some of his friends. So did he establish the Faculty of Islamic Studies that is quite prominent now in Bosnia? It was Dozo who created the curriculum with Ahmed Smailović and another one or two Muslim scholars of the time, and he established the faculty. And I'm not shy to say that if he wasn't Dozo and his fatwas on zakat, collecting the zakat and sadaqatul fitr proceeds, the whole Islamic community in Yugoslavia would have collapsed in communist times. All Islamic traditional high schools would have closed. There were only two that survived. Even those two wouldn't have survived if it wasn't Dozo's fatwas on zakat, encouraging Muslims to give money in a centralized pot, which you can call Baytul Mal, all in one pot, and then channel it to where it's most important. Priority, fiqhul awlawiyat, fiqhul waqi'. All of these things resonate in Dozo's, ijtihad, fatwas, and the way he tackled anything really altogether. I don't want to be theoretical anymore because I feel bad, but I just wanted to share one or two fatwas of his. The fact that most of his works was published in the official organs of the Islamic community of former Yugoslavia, because he died before the breakup of Yugoslavia, speaks for itself. Basically, he was the most prominent pen, and his fatwas were his own individual opinions, answers, but because they were published in official journals like of your Ministry of Religious Education, to everyone, including his colleagues and teachers, they sounded as formal. And he basically, in a way, practically was the Grand Mufti of former Yugoslavia, even though he was not the president of the Ministry of Religious Affairs. Okay, but we don't call it a ministry because it's not a political body. It's an independent body called the Islamic Community of Former Yugoslavia, or IVZ. You can read about that in my dissertation or book if you are interested. But basically, the Balkan scholars were significantly weak at that time, unfortunately. And this must be underlined. The circles of traditional Muslim scholars almost didn't exist. okay, they were weakened at that time when Dozo intellectually peaked between 1960 and 1982. And this was due to very important factors. Between 1878 and 1918, okay, many prominent Balkan Muslim scholars, not only from Bosnia, from Montenegro and Serbia and other parts of former Yugoslavia, they all made the hijrah, migrated to Turkey, Syria, and other Muslim territories. They actually thought it was wajib. You can read a fatwa, a whole article in Arabic, published in Tafsir al-Manar, in the journal, Al-Manar journal by Rashid Rida. هجرة مسلم البوسنة وحكم فيها الحكم في هجرة المسلم البوسنة, like a very good risala he wrote in Arabic, and that was translated into Bosnian by a mufti from Tuzla, Tevfik Abazagic. But this became a huge issue later on because of the recent war in Bosnia. We suffered because all the scholars and the rich men, the bureaucracy part of the Bosnian Muslim elite, the elite migrated to Turkey, to the Ottoman territories, and they thought it was wajib, necessary, compulsory, religious duty to migrate. So there were hardly any scholars left. But the second one is also important. The immense pressure put forth by Tito's or communist anti-religious regime that led most religious scholars to stay behind and to exclude themselves from public life. Basically, they were not brave enough like Dozo. They were not courageous to speak up and write about social justice, to write about IVF, to write about anything, about democracy, freedom to speech, basic human rights, freedom to religious assembly. He analyzed the constitution, the state constitution in his articles, in some of them, as if he was a scholar of law, or let's say law, theory of law in general sense. But he wasn't. He was like a mufti, basically. But there were a couple of traditionalist Muslim scholars who challenged Dozo and his ijtihad and some of his fatawa. This makes it very interesting, but unfortunately I don't have time to write more, to say more about it. But through his fatwa on zakat, I will tell you how the dynamics were between conservative Muslim scholars and modernist or reformist, progressive like Dozo. And there were not many modernists and reformists. He was also he was the lone sheep almost, in a way. I'm sorry to say this language, but hardly he was the only mufti who could do this until Ahmed Smilovic came. But he was a theologian and somebody interested in Islamic philosophy. But them two were the top intellectuals in the communist period, really. Nobody else apart from them, with all respect to other academics and professors, they were mainly Orientalists. These are the only two guys who basically wanted to revive Islamic thought properly. But there were a couple scholars who studied in traditional settings of Turkish, Ottoman, Istanbul type of madrasas from the 19th century and 20th century. They knew Arabic and Turkish. So when Dozo would publish his fatwas in the official journals or organs of the Islamic community, they would read them because they were accessible to everyone. So they would challenge him. So listen to this encounter between a Bosnian Muslim traditionalist conservative scholar or mufti and Dozo. Beautiful. So Dozo clearly supported the tendency of Muslim modernists and reformists to question the classical positions on all matters of faith, including the rules of zakat and zakatul fitr. So in 1967, he published a fatwa on the question of collecting and distributing zakat and zakatul fitr proceeds. This is applicable to you. So to every Muslim country. So in the fatwa, he argued that zakat proceeds may and should definitely be given to the Ministry of Religious Affairs, if you want to say, or Islamic community for its general needs and purposes, projects. Among the native scholars who disagreed with Dozo on this point of view was a scholar called Dervish Spahic. He published his own answer to Dozo's fatwa also in Glasnik, the same official organ. And this is in a nutshell summary, I really summarized this, what this Spahic, traditionalist mufti, said. He says, recently I came across a fatwa which suggests that it is allowed, jaiz, and even mustahab, recommended to give zakat and zakatul fitr proceeds for the general needs of the Islamic community of former Yugoslavia. This opinion is batil. He writes in Arabic, batil, incorrect, for several reasons. And then he lists reasons, 1, 2, 3, 4. First, he said, It contradicts the primary sources of Islam, Quran and Sunnah. Allah decided in Surah Tawbah who is eligible to receive zakat and zakatul fitr proceeds. So Surah 9, Ayah 60. إنما التوبة إنما الصدقات للفقراء والمساكين. You know the ayah. But to be honest with you, this is a very primary level of understanding that ayah from this scholar. I'm not saying he didn't know Arabic, but Dozo will go further. So I would not say that it contradicted. Dozo's fatwa contradicted myself. In my PhD, I will never say my opinion like now, but now I'm telling you my own perspective and analysis, and even my opinion, especially in this conference, because I know that most of you are Muslims, if not all of you. So in my opinion, it doesn't contradict. So I disagree here with Spahic. Secondly, he said, it means that the rights of the poor will be taken away, and that is zulm, injustice. He used the word zulm. Zulm, we say it in Bosnian. I wouldn't say this either, because in the socialist Yugoslavia, communist Yugoslavia, you know, Marxism and socialism, they had social benefits, housing benefits, child benefits, all kinds of things. The homeless people were sheltered, looked after. The poor, impoverished people were all looked after. The unemployment was not high like now. Now is the high unemployment and so on. So it also means that zakat, he says, the reason number 3, it means that sadaqah, he said, but he meant zakat, of many people will not be qabul, accepted. He used the word qabul because he knew Turkish. I agree. I don't agree with this again, but you will see how Dozo answers. This is just what I'm telling you. And finally, he said, this new initiative, look, he's challenging the new initiative. He's challenging the progressive new way of doing things. He said the new initiative would pave the way for many imams to go astray, as they will be transmitting this incorrect opinion to their congregations. So he's basically worried because he's very traditionalist, conservative. He will say, if we agreed with this fatwa, anyone who applies it and follows it and promotes it will be sinful. And any layman that will give his zakat in this pot to Baytul Mal or centralized pot, he might not be accepted, and Dozo will be blamed basically on the day of judgment. This is a little bit too much, because who knows what is acceptable, what is not. And we have now proven, I mean, I'm analyzing this is in the 60s, yeah, towards the end of 1970s. We all know later on that no one later on ever questioned Dozo's fatwas. They all agreed, and now is the common practice, and the whole Islamic community is doing that, but nothing but that, and the budget is like 6 million pounds a year from these proceeds, collections from zakat and zakatul fitr and the qurbani skins alone. So this Spahic's criticism is a fatwa, in my opinion, of its own. According to Spahic, it is wrong to give zakat and zakatul fitr proceeds for the general needs of Islamic community, lil haja, or fi sabilillah in a general sense. One of his arguments is that the poor and the needy would be wronged and by not receiving those proceeds instead. But this is not true, because the poor and the needy always benefit the most. In response, look, this is another fatwa now from Dozo. In response to this criticism, Dozo wrote a long fatwa, published again in the same issue where Spahic's criticism was published, because Dozo was the editor of the journal and Preporod and everything, really. In a summary, this is the reply. I don't need to comment, really, but I have my own analysis of this if we have time, maybe when we have questions. Look how Dozo replied to this criticism. First, and it's a summary. The whole fatwa is like 10 pages long. Because of the social circumstances in which we live in Yugoslavia, the issue of giving zakat and zakatul fitr proceeds towards the general needs of the Islamic community became so paramount and crucial. This is, I'm reading Dozo's words. I translated this myself into English. First, we would like to again stress the necessity to give your zakat and zakatul fitr proceeds to the Islamic community and its needs. Secondly, we shall categorically prove that it is legally valid, it is jaiz, and even mustahab to do so, recommended. And then he analyzes the ayah from Surah Tawbah. According to the verse 60 of Surah Tawbah, giving zakat proceeds for the general needs of our Islamic community falls under the one of the deserving categories as mentioned in the noble verse, namely, fi sabilillah. Rashid Rida, he writes here, Rashid Rida, a well-known mufassir, asserts the phrase fi sabilillah includes all necessary things to maintain the practice of Islam. The writer of Fiqh Sunnah, he doesn't say who, Sayyid Sadiq, you all know that, suggests that the best way of giving fi sabilillah is to support those who preach Islam for da'wah. And then I skipped a few lines. I have already skipped a few lines before as well. I'm sorry, I didn't tell you. Indeed, zakat proceeds must be distributed to one of the 7 categories mentioned in the Quran. So Joseph is not going away of this framework. He's not going away of this paradigm of Surah Tawbah, Ayah 60. The dilemma, however, is which of the categories should be given a priority? Fiqhul awlawiyat. Which one do you prioritize from the ayah? I'm now skipping several paragraphs, and then I say, quoting Joseph, when solving this dilemma, Joseph says, the following points should be considered by everyone. First, during the reign of Abu Bakr, the category of those whose hearts have been reconciled, mu'allafati qulubuhum, became suspended back then. As we all know, the category of firriqab, freeing slaves, vanished over time. You know, the slavery was abolished basically over 100 years ago. Now I'm skipping some paragraphs, citing Joseph again. In our opinion, he doesn't say in my opinion, he's so humble, moderate. In our opinion, the categories of the traveler, Ibn Sabil, and the debtor, al-gharimin, people overburdened with debts, should be suspended too. So I don't really know any scholar who would say something like that except Mustafa Meraghi. He wrote something like this at that time. He said, in my opinion, the travelers, because people can travel with their credit card now and debit card or their phone and pay by Wise Pay and Google Pay and whatever, right? He said, it's not the same like before. Traveling was dangerous and difficult. So he said these two should be suspended because since it is no longer practical to distribute zakat and zakat al-fitr proceeds to those people, we travel at major airports and we go to a hotel, isn't it? When I used to, before the pandemic, go to Holland for conferences, to Germany, to India, or I hope I come one day to Indonesia, we had lovely luxury way of traveling. Why should you give me zakat? You know, I'm a posh, rich person, basically, you can tell from the suitcase, from the way we dress, and the taxis that drop us off, and so on and so forth. I'm against it, but that is the reality. And then he says, and in our Yugoslav context, the category of the poor, al-fuqara, and the needy, al-masakin, could be suspended too. He's not saying let's suspend it. He said you could talk of suspending it. It could be suspended too because the local authorities, the government, the state looks after them. The poor and the needy, as I told you, unemployed people, they have a payment. They are on a special role, and in Bosnia is still like that. Now I'm skipping and finishing. So the category of fi sabilillah, he says, remains as the only relevant one in our time. And therefore, he says, should be given the priority over all others mentioned in the ayah. Now skipping for a few paragraphs, from whatever angle we look, I'm citing Joseph again, securing a financial basis, a good, reliable financial basis for our Islamic community of socialist, communist Yugoslavia has become the biggest priority, paramount, he said. By solving this crucial matter, many other issues would become solved naturally by themselves. And the fatwa finishes like that. Now, like I said, I have analysis of it, but I'm afraid I have run out of time and I won't do that. Can I just read the summary key points of the main achievements of the project and these fatwas? Joseph's fatwas became official fatwa, authorized by the Grand Mufti and the President. Later on, it was long discussions. Joseph wrote 50 fatwas later on defending his position to different people and objections of scholars and intellectuals. But in reality, what happened afterwards? After Joseph died, especially, all of these fatwas and the whole project that was approved by the Grand Mufti Suleiman Kemura and the whole, senior council of Muslim scholars in Yugoslavia strengthened what? The shaky and impoverished financial situation of the Islamic community of former Yugoslavia. They were, I'm really telling you, if you study this, they were impoverished. Okay, it allowed the continuation of 500 old Ghazi Husrev Bey Madrasa that would have closed, no doubt. Okay, I'm nearly finished. It led to the establishment of the Islamic Theological Faculty. The faculty was established and it facilitated. facilitated the production of the Islamic community's official organs, journals, including Glasnik, Preporod, and Takwin, the annual official organs, publications. And it basically also published Quran translations, amazing. Notably, the project is being implemented until this day, and today without any antagonism. There's no scholar, Imam, or person, maybe a few Salafi scholars who came from Medina University who are objecting against this, but not really. One may ask, was there another or better solution for Dozo? I couldn't see one personally myself, having analyzed this so many times. So as noted above, when Dozo issued his initial fatwa on zakat in 1967, and then he issued another 40 or so to defend his position, the economic basis of the Islamic community of former Yugoslavia were virtually destroyed by certain state laws, nationalization, possession of property, wealth, forest, land, and so forth, by forceful impoverishment by the state. So what could you do with the state? You can't say, give us all the awqaf back. When they took all the awqaf, this is a pity, but that was the truth. Moreover, the idea to negotiate with the Tito's regime, the communist regime, was a mission impossible. Yeah, for a possible repossession of the nationalized permanent endowments of awqaf was never viable. Until this day, we are battling, even though it's a Muslim government now. Muslim state, they haven't given back all the endowments that belong to the Islamic community, including most precious shops in the city center, in the old town, in the capital of Sarajevo. I'm telling you, this is true. So given the project, given the project is legitimate in Islamic law, because I am not a mufti myself, I'm not a mujtahid myself, so I can't comment whether Dozo's fatwa is valid from Islamic point of view, whether they are top scholars or mujtahid mutlaq, absolute mujtahids, who can disagree with him on the notion of fi sabilillah, whether it includes da'wah issues and this and that. I can't comment. You can read my analysis in my book, because I actually lean towards the traditionalist position. I'm a Hanafi scholar myself, but not a mufti or a jurist or a mujtahid in any capacity, in my opinion. And Dozo was the lowest level of a mujtahid. He was not, in my opinion, a mujtahid in Hanafi madhab at all. In fact, that's a separate notion. We can talk about his views on madhahib. He didn't adhere necessarily in theory to any madhab. He was like Muhammad Abduhu and Rashid Rida in this regard, or Shaltut, but in practical terms, he did issue his fatwas according to Hanafi madhab almost always. So given what he said is legally acceptable to Muslim jurists from any place in the world, let's say his ijtihad is sahih, but even if he made a mistake, he will get a reward according to hadith, isn't it? But let's say his ijtihad was not baseless, it was grounded on proper evidence, Islamic evidence. One really and truly needs to acknowledge its historic significance. It's historic, already historic and pragmatic significance and impact that it has had. In conclusion, this paper has introduced the modernist and reformist thought of Hosein Dozo on the conception and interpretation of contemporary Islamic reformist thought situated within the Balkan complex socio-political and cultural contexts. Dozo was one of the very few Balkan Muslim scholars who recognized both the severity of the dilemma produced by modernity and the confidence that Islam can be a dynamic force in a modernized society anywhere, really. Dozo's time was characterized by ideological repression, atheism, communism, and strong anti-religious propaganda. On the other hand, these deep political, social, and cultural challenges aided the spread of Islamic modernist and reformist views and ideas in the region, because people were desperate to have something reasonable and new. Dozo was a modernist in the sense that he urged the pursuit of modern thought, confident that it could only confirm the religious thought of Islam. Even a brief survey of Dozo's scholarly efforts will tell one that he raised his voice against dogmatism and rigid Islamic thought, like rigid conservative approach to Islamic sources. With his numerous publications, Dozo effectively communicated the traditional Islamic teachings and made the inner reality of Islamic law, especially, and Islamic faith in general, accessible to his fellow co-religionists, fellow Muslims in Yugoslavia. I believe, that Hosein Dozo is a thinker worthy of far more attention that he has received so far. I'm really believing this. His diverse roles as a theologian, as a mufassir, as a jurist, faqih, as a mufti, as a teacher, lecturer, and also as a preacher, provide an excellent opportunity to explore various dimensions of Islam as seen from within. And the last sentence is this: as seen above, or in this paper, the views and ideas of modernist and reformist strands of interpretation of Islam are clearly reflected in Dozo's works. On the other hand, through the prism of his spirit and thought, these views and ideas have gained a local Yugoslav or Balkan dimension. Let's remember this. It gained a local dimension. He was affected by the local notion, by the Balkan region, its culture, its habits, and so forth, and the context, multicultural, multi-religious society, and so forth. So it gained a local Yugoslav, Balkan dimension and faced many significant challenges and examinations. While Dozo's success in explaining the relevance of Islam in our modern times may be debated and questioned, and the analytical depth of his understanding of modern sciences can be faulted, there is no doubt that he was aware of the most important issues confronting the modern mind, especially the modern Muslim mind. And before a definitive assessment of Dozo's place in the history of contemporary Islamic thought can be made, a great deal of research into his legal and theological thought, in my opinion, still needs to be carried out. Another 10, 20 PhDs could be written on Dozo. I'm not exaggerating. I really apologize for being too long, and thank you all so much for your patience and giving me all this attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sejad for I think your very comprehensive insight on Hosein Dozo's thought and ideas. And I believe hearing your comprehensive and stimulating speech, we are now convinced that Hosein Dozo is indeed a very influential Muslim scholar that I think we here in Indonesia, for example, should also consider his ideas and his thought. And you cover many aspects of his ideas. I think you conceptualizes, let's so call his paradigmatic thinking as a modernist and reformist Muslim scholar. And you also mentioned some examples of his fatwas and some encounters between him and his so-called opposition or responses from different Islamic orientation. So it's indeed a very comprehensive account, and I'm happy to hear that you also already mentioned some comparison between those in Bosnia and Indonesian context, which is I think it's very useful for us. And to make this comparative perspective even stronger in our session today, we have a second speaker, and our Professor Faisal Ismail. He is one of the professors in our faculty of Islamic Studies, and for new students of master and doctoral program here, you will be meeting him as one of the lecturers in Islamic thought, the history of Islamic thought. He teach courses on Islamic thinking, Islamic thought, Islamic method, and those kind of things. So I think because we have a very limited time, so I would like to invite our Professor Faisal Ismail to give some sort of comparative perspective, talking about the dynamic of Islamic thought in Indonesian context. And hopefully from this comparative perspective, we can identify some important new ways of research and analysis in the future. And for technical notes, I think for those who would like to raise questions, you can start by just writing down in the chat box, and then if we do have time, we'll pass the question to our guest speaker. Okay, because the time is limited, I would like to invite Professor Ismail to present his speech. Time is yours, Professor Ismail. Prof. Faisal?
Yes.
Okay.
Wait a moment, please. It's a technical problem.
Because we are very limited time, so you could talk for about maybe 5 to 10 minutes, I'm afraid, Professor. Then we can allocate for like 10 minutes for Q&A in the end of our session.
So we continue this still right now.
I think we can continue, Prof. Faisal.
Is it still Azan? So we will continue.
It's okay, Prof. We just go on.
Okay. Yeah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Alhamdulillah.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on this occasion. First of all, I would like to appreciate Professor Said's presentation. It's very useful and very fruitful for us to understand the Islam or Jesus' legacy in the context of Balkan. My presentation will deal with the dynamic of Islamic thought in Indonesia. First of all, I would like to stress that Indonesia is known as a country where the biggest Muslim population in the world. It's a big country where Muslim community make it the majority of the population. There are many Muslim scholars and intellectuals living in Indonesia. Some of them were and are educated and graduated from Western universities, and some of them were and are educated from Middle Eastern University. But the majority of them were and are educated and graduated from university in the country, Indonesia. They have different views, ideas, interpretation, and thoughts about Islam. The majority of them are educated and graduated from Indonesia. First, if I would categorize the Islamic thought in Indonesia, you can categorize into 7 categories. First, critical Islamic thought. This thought is expressed by Muslim scholars who do not accept any views, ideas, or opinion of intellectual Muslim which are regarded as contrary to the teaching of the Quran and Hadith. Second, rational Islamic thought. This thought is formulated based on the Quranic teaching and Hadith by using rational approach. Professor Harun Nasution, who to some extent adopted Mu'tazilite theological view, can be included in this Muslim group. Yeah, we understand that Professor Nasution was a professor at Islamic University in Jakarta, and he was adopted M.Ag teaching. I think he was one of the prominent figure of Islamic reformist Islamic thought. The third is the reformist Islamic thought. This thought is developed by Muslim intellectuals who are concerned with change and reform by using ijtihad or logical interpretation of the Quran and Hadith of the Prophet of Muhammad in response to social cultural transformation and modernity. I think I would like to say that Muhammadiyah, I think, is a very important organization in Indonesia, which has this kind of result. Many intellectuals of Muhammadiyah, like Rais, Azhar, Bashir, something like very prominent in voicing legal interpretation of Quranic interpretation, and Muhammadiyah does not follow any mazhab, but the Muhammadiyah promote legal understanding of the Quran and the stress the importance of ijtihad in understanding of socio-cultural change and modernity in the country. Muhammadiyah succeed in improving school, madrasa, university, and building many hospitals, and also taking care of the poor people and giving charity to the Muslim and the other Muslim. I think Muhammadiyah is big organization in Indonesia that contribute many things in terms of social change in Islam, and also make contribution in Indonesian education. The fourth is contextual Islamic thought. This thought is formulated from the Quranic verse and Hadith based on social and cultural context. One of the intellectual Muslims belong to this group is Abdurrahman Wahid. Wahid's idea was called Indonesianism of Islam, or Indonesia we call Pribumisasi Islam. He proposed to replace the Islamic Greek
Did we lose the professor?
Faisal?
I can't hear anything.
Yeah, we lost your voice, Professor.
Okay.
The voice of professor being muted.
Yeah, we having technical issues. Hopefully, it will be resolved soon. Okay, Prof. Faisal. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
We still can hear your voice, Prof. Faisal.
Textual Islamic thought. This thought is advocated by Salafi group which reject and denounce some religious practices performed by traditional Muslims, such as the celebration of the Prophet Muhammad birthday, Maulid Nabi, Tahlil, reading the Quran, remembering God, and praying after the death of Muslims, and intercession of our soul. So this group reject and denounce this kind of practice. They argue that this kind of religious practices and ceremonies are not taught in the Quran and the Sunnah, and were not performed by the Prophet Muhammad during his life. Observers call them as Takfiri group, i.e. accusing other Muslims outside of the group as practicing bid'ah or religious innovation. 7. Radical Islamic thought and action. This thought and action are advocated by a group of radical Muslims who carry out violent action and attack and also terror in the name of Islam. Violent attack, terror, and bombing are part of their action. One of the horrible attacks of this group took place in Kuta, which is known as the Bali bombing in 2002. Many American and European tourists were killed. The main actors of the Bali bombing were Amrozi and Mukhlas. Similar to the Amrozi and Mukhlas radical action, the movement of Jami'ah Islamiyah and the Jami'ah Ansarud Daulah. The main purpose of these two groups is to establish an Indonesian government based on Sharia or Islamic law. The mainstream of Indonesian Muslim community reject the radical thought and action of these two groups and the likes. The mainstream of Indonesian Muslim community has strongly opposed this radical group by stressing that Islam doesn't fix radicalism and terrorism. It is important to note that the 5 categories or the 7 categories of the dynamic of Islamic thought mentioned above is my view or my opinion based on my observation as a professor for Islamic thought and civilization. It is possible that other scholars or professors to have view and opinion differ from my view and opinion. I think thank you very much for your attention. Not so long, but it is just kind of summary of the condition, the situation of the dynamic of Islamic thought in Indonesia. Thank you very much, Sabtu.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Faisal Ismail, for your short but concise speech, insight on the dynamic of Islamic thought in Indonesia. I think you talk more about the constellation and the categories of Islamic thought in Indonesia. And if we comparing, some explanations offered by Dr. Sejad on the ideas of Hosein Dozo, we can see actually some strong links connection between his reformist and modernist ideas with the so-called reformist and modernist Islamic thought in Indonesia. So I think this is a very important area of research, I think, for future research and studies for our students to pursue in the future. Okay, according to our original schedule, we should stop our session at 3:30 p.m. here, Professor Mekic in Indonesia. But we're trying to stick with this, but we can see if we have a lot of questions, we can extend a little bit our time for question and answers. And we already see a question in chat box. This is from, so we start our Q&A session now. First, I would like to offer opportunities if some of you, one of you would like to raise a direct question to our speakers. This is the time for you. And while waiting, we can go on with the question that already written down in the chat box. First of all, any questions from the audience? If you want to raise a direct question, please just raise your hand so I can see, and then I'll give time for you. If not, then we can start off with the question from one of the participants in the chat box. I'm sure Dr. Mekic already saw the question as well, but I can repeat the question. This is from Muhammad Ainun Najib.
Where can we see the question, please?
In the chat box. I can read the question for you. Yes. Assalamualaikum. I want to ask. This is, I think, actually referring to your speech about the examples of the fatwas of Hosein Dozo, and this particular participant was asking about asking you to, I think, to explain more about Hosein Dozo's fatwas on zakat, I think, and he was thinking that Dozo of the opinion that zakat could be suspended for, he mentioned here, Fuqara and Masakin in some condition. So yeah. I think he was asking some more elaboration on this. So
yes,
you could try to answer this one.
Yeah, definitely. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, indeed, it sounds really radical. I really apologize. I have sore throat. That's why I sound a little bit strange today, and I'm struggling to talk. But it is really radical to say something like that. Even to suspend Ibn Sabil and Al-Gharimin or any of those categories. It's a very brave move to make. He's saying, I'm not advocating that we talk about suspending this category, but you could talk about it in the socialist, former Yugoslavia's context in particular. However, if you read my analysis of his fatwa in the book, maybe we can say, under the notion of fi sabilillah, you may include so many different things Islamically, and you can say zakat proceeds, or zakatul fitr proceeds as well, may be given to schools and universities and colleges, and the Ministry of Education can rely on the pots of zakat pots, like Baitul Mal in Malaysia, for example, and I'm sure in Indonesia is very similar, and they can finance and give wages, salaries to the teachers and professors and admin workers and so on and so forth, because it's such a huge income and budget. So you can question this, whether it's good, ethical, not ethical. I can agree with Joseph what he's saying on that point. When it comes to the Fuqara and Masakin, if you can just bear with me, what I actually read in the classical books, okay, primarily in Hanafi madhab, because Joseph in a way, was issuing that fatwa to Hanafi Muslims, or Muslims who follow Hanafi madhab. So it is very brave and courageous. No one has said, according to my findings, okay, that al-fuqara wal-masakin could at any maybe time in place, at any place since the beginning of Islam until the Judgment Day probably, suspended, because the key primary two categories of people who are eligible to receive the zakat proceeds are al-fuqara wal-masakin, because if you really think about it, the main objective of this institution of zakah is to take the proceeds from the richer people, or people who are eligible, who have to pay zakat, and it goes back to the fuqara. يُؤْخَذُ مِنْ أَغْنِيَائِهِمْ وَتُرَدُّ عَلَى فُقَرَائِهِمْ. It's in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So basically, it is really strange, because when I looked at this, I made some comparison with England, not just the socialist affairs or the current schemes that were in place in former Yugoslavia, how the social services really looked after the poor and the needy and unemployed. But even in today's time, when the situation is much better than 70s and 60s and 80s, there's still far too many unemployed people and poor and needy people, even in rich countries like Germany and England. So to say that they shouldn't be receiving zakat proceeds just because they live in a rich country like the United States is a bit too much. It's too general, in my opinion, one. Secondly, this is, if you were talking about suspending the fuqara and masakin category, you might be actually talking about questioning the principle of zakat, the whole institution of zakat, because the whole point of why zakat is there, and it can actually improve, the economic basis of Muslim communities across the globe, is because the zakat proceeds are collected from people who have surplus of wealth in different types, and then given to the very poor and the needy who have nothing or hardly anything to have. And if you go to the definition of faqir and miskin, that's even more astonishing, because the miskin, in my opinion, is like penniless person, like not a homeless only, a person who doesn't have anything. لَيْسَ لَهُ دِينَارٌ وَلَا دِرْهَمٌ. Whereas al-faqir, you can say a poor person might have a house in some countries, but definitely he's not going to own a house in Germany or America or England because it's too expensive in London. But he might have a bit of land in Nigeria or in Turkey that he can't really cultivate and use, and he might have one cow and a goat, but that's all that he has, and he can't produce milk, he can't do some farming on his land much, and he can't make much profit. So he owns something, but he's still poor. I don't know myself, but in a Muslim majority country, I guess there must be like Hisba kind of police that goes around and verifies on this and that address, okay? Just like we verify who owns what, we can start verifying who are zakatable people, who are eligible by law of that country and the norm of that country, who are genuinely the people through the social services who genuinely deserve zakat, who are not cheating the system, therefore not cheating Allah. And they will be, in my opinion, and that should be the practice that all Muslim countries, I'm suggesting, in Muslim majority context and in Muslim minority context, because it is also institutionalized at a different level, non-governmental level, we should have application forms basically which ask different questions and have different criteria to establish whether you are faqir or miskin according to some basic definitions and standards, and therefore you will be zakat eligible whether you live in Los Angeles, London, or Jakarta, or Sarajevo, or Istanbul. It's irrelevant. So thank you for your question. I agree, and I have written once, I think, in a Bosnian journal, that this, if Dozo was today alive, he would have withdrawn some of his views from that fatwa, especially this very position where he is saying maybe even fuqara and masakin, the two categories, don't need to be given zakat proceeds. I think today he would say no, they always have to, and we should never contemplate suspending those two. But he probably would have said something about people in debt, because people run into financial crisis for different reasons, family pressures, people do scams on them, cyberbullying, crimes. So people lose money and incur bankruptcy, not because they were totally irresponsible or negligible, ghafilin. It was a number of issues which affected their bankruptcy. So therefore, in my opinion, zakat really should be given to people who are in huge financial crisis, debts, to take them out of it, including institutions like colleges and schools, so that they can recover, the deficit. That's what I would say. If you have any more things to say, you can ask.
Thank you very much, Dr. Syed Mekich, for your response. I think again, this stresses the importance of contextually, locating, understanding ideas and thought. Okay, we still have around 10 minutes left, so I think it would be enough for 1 or 2 questions if you would like. Okay, I see someone raising his hand. Abdullah Manan, are you there? Yeah, please, if you have a question, and you can raise your direct question to our speakers.
Check.
Yes, we can hear your voice.
طيب ربما أنا أتحدث باللغة العربية.
تفضل.
طيب. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام.
أنا أخوكم في الله وطالبكم عبد الله منان، طالب جديد في مرحلة الماجستير تخصص الشريعة البحتة، يعني جامعة إسلامية إندونيسيا. سعادتكم وفضيلتكم رئيس الجامعة وسعادتكم عمداء الكليات، خاصة كلية الدراسات العليا، دكتوراه في مرحلة الدكتوراه وكذلك الماجستير، وكذلك اللجنة الأستاذية والمشاركين. عندي يعني ماذا سؤالا، يعني لكن قبل ذلك يعني أعبر أن يعني حدثت تغييرات في طبيعة كل المجتمعات، وعندما نحن نتحدث عن الإسلام فهناك أكثر من 600 مليون مسلم يعيشون في دول غير مسلمة. يجب وضع مصالحهم في الاعتبار. جذر أو هذا الدين هو معاني السلم والمسالمة، لأن الإسلام دين السلام ونبينا نبي السلام، وتحية الإسلام والمسلمين السلام والجنة دار السلام. وطبعا فلسفة السلم هي القضية الراسخة في الفكر الإسلامي، كما قال تعالى: يا أيها الذين آمنوا ادخلوا في السلم كافة. فسلام شامل مع النفس وكذلك مع الآخر والمجتمع وحتى مع الحيوان والجماد ومع الكون كله. وطبعا فلسفة السلام هي الفلسفة الأصيلة الرسيخة في ديننا الإسلام. ثم هناك قضية تجديد الفكر الإسلامي بشكل عام، وكذلك هناك تجديد الفكر الفقهي بشكل خاص، كما يعني سمعنا من ما يعني ألقى سعادتكم البروفيسور سجاد مكي، بالعربية سجاد مكي. فأن الإرث الفكري للبوسنة يقدم الكثير من الأدلة على يعني أن أوروبا والإسلام يعني بعيدان عن كونهما غير متوافقين، كما مثلا عندما قال الرئيس الفرنسي إيمانويل ماكرون الصيف الماضي بأنه يريد إنشاء قواعد المؤسسات الإسلامية في فرنسا، ويبذل جهدا يعني أوسع لإيجاد طريقة للتعبير عن الدين بشكل ماذا يتداخل مع ما يرونه قيما إيروبية. فأن ما لم يلاحظ هو أن إسلاما أوروبيا متسامحا موجودا في أوروبا منذ قرون طبعا، وخاصة في جنوب شرق القارة، قارة أوروبا. فحين يرى المسلمون البوسنيون والألبان والأتراك أنفسهم أنهم ماذا يرون أنهم مسلمون تماما وأوروبيون تماما. فما رأيكم يا فضيلتكم في قول القائل من يرى إسلاما ليبراليا فليتعلم من البوسنة؟ نعم،
هاي تهمة يعني،
اسمح
لنا تهمة جميلة.
شكرا، جزاكم الله خيرا يا إمام.
حياك الله.
Okay, شكرا.
طيب تريدني أن أرد بالعربي ولا بالإنجليزي؟
Okay. Yeah, I'll leave it to you, Professor. You could answer in Arabic or English, but if could recommend, I think, to also allow our participants who couldn't speak Arabic, you could answer in
yes.
English as well, I think. And this is a very important question.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think the majority of people will understand English better, and it's going to be recorded as well. But mashallah, I have to say, Brother Abdullah or Akhuya Fillah spoke an excellent Arabic. I was impressed with his Arabic indeed. And a very good question and very good introduction to it. Yes, I am a European. That is my background, that is my race. Just like you are from Southeast Asia and you are proud of your heritage, and it's a very old culture. Islam in Europe, like you said, is not a new phenomenon. I don't even know when it comes to my family tree. I'm not talking about myself, Bosnia, the Balkans. We don't even know when our Ajdad, forefathers, accepted Islam. You are talking about 500 years. Generations and generations of people who were born into Islam and lived Islam, and a traditional Sufi type of Islam. It was the modernism that came at the turn of the last century, really, the French Revolution, and what followed after it that came to the Balkans, primarily Bosnia, because Bosnia was always the majority place which had most Muslims in Europe, and Albania, like you said. Turkey, you can say, yes, part of Turkey is in Europe, Istanbul, but as you know, Turkey is a huge country. It's, Asia Central as well. The majority of Muslims in Turkey are on the Asian soil. So anyway, this notion of a European Islam is a very new field that many scholars have tried to tackle and define. I don't know if there is a very clear definition on it in my humble opinion, but I can clearly tell you, my background is a South Slav Muslim who was born as a Muslim, and speaking on a personal level here, and I don't know if I can represent the Islamic community of Bosnia here, I wouldn't say so, but I can tell you roughly what their position is. For us Muslims in Bosnia, Bosnian Muslims, right? And there were many who studied in Indonesia and especially in Malaysia, right? There are many who studied in the last 20 years or so. My colleagues, my former classmates. For us, to be honest with you, Bosnian identity to a layman, non-practicing Muslim, maybe is number one, the main identity. But for us Muslim Bosnians who know about Islam, even at the high school level, or let's say you are a postgraduate student now, at an undergraduate level, Bosnian Muslim who has a BA in Islamic studies or in Islamic philosophy or in Islamic theology, no doubt sees his first and foremost identity and, like you said, most comprehensive framework within which he operates Islam, the religion of Islam. It is a moderate version, but not a liberal. I disagree there. So there is a big difference between liberalism and what I'm talking about here. If you read my book on Dozo, for example, there are hardly any books that talk about what is the difference between Islamic modernism and radicalism and Islamism, and what is Islamic reformism or reformist movements. Who are they? Did Dozo begin a new movement that is now going to be called Dozo's movement, reformist movement in Islamic law? No, he didn't. There were some Bosnian scholars before him who started the reforms, like Jamaluddin, not Jamaluddin Afghani, a Bosnian scholar called Jamaluddin Čaušević, okay? He studied in Istanbul in a traditional Turkish settings. He graduated from the Faculty of Law, Kulliyat Sharia wal Qanun fi Istanbul, at the year 1900, right at the beginning of the 20th century. he went to Egypt to sit down and listen to Abduhu's tafsir, yeah, in his circle, in his tafsir circle. He came back, and him and some of his students in Bosnia started translating Tafsir al-Manar. So Dozo was not the first person who was introduced to those notions and ideas, but what Dozo was, he was in between in his theology between Mu'tazila and a Maturidi. Between, you can't really define him, is he a Mu'tazila or a Maturidi or Ash'ari? He was all of them. Sometimes he was like a really profound Mu'tazilite. At other time, he wasn't like that. But liberalists' views came from the very liberalist movements in Istanbul, okay, like Kemalists, because like the respected Professor Faisal Ismail, he said in his talk, like they wanted to change the greeting of Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah into good morning in Indonesian language. So we had a few people, but they were never prominent or who tried to basically incorporate local, which is mainly Christian culture in Bosnia and adapt Islam to it. What has actually happened is the opposite. Islam dominated the local Balkan culture, and Islam is the norm in food, in dress code, in everything. And we are in Bosnia traditionalist Muslims, mainly engaging with tasawwuf, spiritual self-purification, if you wish to say, tazkiyatun nafs. We are not Salafis. Salafis will never succeed in Bosnia. Irhabis will never succeed in Bosnia. Yes, there were a few members who ran to the ISIS when ISIS rose in the Middle East. There were a few, but that was never an issue. There's one or two para jamaats, they call them, in Bosnia, with hardly 10, 20 members attending the Jummah prayers. Everything else is moderate, traditionalist Islam that is firmly and strongly rooted in the Ottoman heritage and legacy, and the contemporary, or let's say current Bosnian Muslim scholars who are in authority, in the position to decide, to rule and to power. They are all, in my opinion, moderate, simple, genuine, sincere Muslims who have an average knowledge of Islam, but they are not liberalists. They will not compromise the universal values and principles of Islam. Dozo also didn't do so. Yes, he had a couple of views but that were critical in theology, and that's all. You know, like the second nuzul of Isa, he questions. He's not the first. Mahmoud Shaltut has written about it, but you can't declare someone like that liberalist. It's a theology. We don't know future. When it comes to law, positive law, fiqh, yes, you can. If somebody comes now and issues a fatwa and says, Conway, you know, mainstream banking is fine. You can take a high street mortgage for your house, and you can say suspending riba, interest. That is problematic. Is there a Bosnian scholar who says such a thing? No. If there is someone who says such a thing, he's not a scholar at all, in my opinion, at any level. So that's not the case, basically. Bosnian Muslims are traditionalists, practicing, they might falter on some prayers, but it's due to their weakness, negligence on a personal level, and they acknowledge that, but institutionally, no. Institutionally, and even in our publications in Bosnia of late, of the last 60, 70 years, what is promoted is Ghazali. What is promoted is Maulana Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi and his Masnawi, Ghazali and his Ihya Ulumuddin, Abu Hanifa, and all famous prominent Muslim scholars that were accepted by all four madhahib, all Muslim Sunni schools, and mainly Maturidi Aqidah, but nobody really knows which Aqidah, layman. They don't know which Aqidah they follow, but it is Aqidah to Ahli Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which is also important to underline here. And our Islamic Authority has published resolutions which say that we belong to the silsila, heritage, which has a chain of transmission all the way to the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with prominent scholars, you know, the last of them being the Shaykhul Islam in Istanbul. So we have a very strong heritage, and we certainly belong to Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah in the most classical and traditionalist notion. And I don't know of Bosnian muftis who are liberalists and trying to change universal norms or making halal haram and vice versa, but I know some Bosnian Muslim recent scholars who are very strict, like Salafis. They have come up, say you have to wear hijab in this way, and you can't go to a pub, and so on and so forth, strict on food items and things like that. So it's actually the opposite. There is more rise of caution and wara', wara', scrupulousness in religious matters, dress code, morality, akhlaq, khuluqiyat in general sense, rather than liberalism, ibahiyin, or whatever you want to call them, strong secularists, ilmaniyin. There is no such a thing. That existed when the Austro-Hungarians came, and it ceased. Jaws obviously also helped to establish a more acceptable version of reforming Islamic law, which is rooted solidly based on the sources, the Quran and the Hadith, on qiyas, on ijma', on maslaha mursala, on maqasid al-sharia, in the best sense, actually. So I can go on and on and on to prove these points to you. But like I said, let us not assume Bosnian Muslims as liberalists or loose or weak and not practicing. You will find some of the most practicing and traditionalist people, but moderate, not extremist in their views or practice in the Balkans.
Syukran ya Syekh.
Barakallah fiik.
Mashkurin wa majurin insyaAllah.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Said Each, for your response. And dear audience, participants, sisters and brothers, it's already 3:37, so about 7 extra from our original schedule. I understand that there might be a lot of questions from the audience need to be asked, be raised, but we have very limited time. So I'm afraid we have to stop our session today. But I think we have a very stimulating and insightful session today, having our distinguished speaker, Professor Dr. Sejad from England, would like to share his precious time with us today. So thank you very much for your generosity, Professor Mekic. And this is very, comprehensive and comparative accounts provided by our both guest speakers, our speakers. I just want to highlight 3 important points that we can look at as takeaways from this session. First, I believe that having heard insightful speech from Professor Mekic, our knowledge or our understanding of Hosein Dozo's thought, I believe, has been enhanced and strengthened. So now we believe that Hosein Dozo is indeed one of influential modernist and reformist Muslim scholar in the Balkan region in European context. And that is the first note I think we can mention. The second one, having heard comparative insights from both speakers, we can see there are a lot of strong links and overlappings in terms of basic ideas, basic thinking, basic proposal in dealing with some of the important challenges, modern challenges between those thought and ideas and some of our own Muslim thinkers here in Indonesia. And this led to the last note that I can mention, that this, I think, opened up a lot of opportunities for us, especially for our students here, to start developing new research studies on more comparative perspectives between the Islamic thinking, the dynamic Islamic thought, Islamic thinking in European context and in Indonesian context. I think this is a very important area of research that many of us can pursue in the near future. And I think with that note, I would like to end our session today. So thank you very much for all audience, for all participants in this online meeting. I hope you find this very useful and stimulating. And as a final note, I would like to invite everyone to join me in giving a big thank to our distinguished speaker, especially Professor Dr. Sejad Mekic. Thank you very much again for your time and for your knowledge you shared with us, and also for Professor Faisal Ismail. So that's the end of our session. Thank you again for your attention. I would end with Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Oh, wabarakatuh.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Abdi. Thank you, Mr. Abdi, for moderating this seminar today. And sorry, before I have trouble with Mr. Sal and whistle to sweep talk, but still going well, alhamdulillah. And I would like to thank so much to the speaker, Dr. Sejad and also Dr. Professor Faisal Ismail for the informative and interesting presentation, and also to the participant for very active participation. And ladies and gentlemen, finally we get to the last session in this event, that is closing, and let us close this event with saying hamdalah together.
Alhamdulillahirrabbilalamin.
Alhamdulillahirrabbilalamin.
Professor Sejad, thank you very much for your coming, and we can continue for cooperation next time. Okay.
Please, I just really wanted to take this opportunity to thank you, Professor Yusdani Ali Rahman, for giving me this opportunity, for inviting me and your department, and your whole university, your president, your vice chancellor, and all those lovely academics and professors and lovely people in Indonesia. It's an honor to give a speech and presentation with Professor Faisal Ismail and the president that he spoke, and I was absolutely impressed by Professor Supriyanto Abdi, the way in which he handled the whole session, the spokesperson as well. I enjoyed my time, and I wish you all the very best to your department. And if I can be of any further help to your department or in any other way from England, any cooperations, please stay in touch with me. Stay in touch, inshallah ta'ala.
Okay, inshallah. Thank you.
Inshallah.
You are welcome.
For Mr. Yusdani, any remark or speech for closing statement?
Okay,
for our event today?
Okay, thank you, Mbak Tias, and thank you and great appreciation to Professor Dr. Imam Sejad and also to Professor Faisal Ismail and also to Mas Abdi. I think it is very interesting seminar, and then maybe next time we can continue at the topic of Islamic studies or Islamic law, Islamic economy, etc. Once again, thank you to Professor Dr. Sejad Meki, Professor Faisal Ismail, Mbak Tias, and also Mas Abdi. Okay, the time I return to Mbak Tias. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for Mr. Yusdani M.Ag for his speech. And well, alhamdulillahirrabbilalamin. I think enough for today. That's all. I do apologize if I had mistake during this seminar. And thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Boleh izin live, Mbak?
Boleh, Ibu.
Terima kasih. Terima kasih, Bapak. Thank you very much.
Oke.
Terima kasih, Bapak, semuanya.
Jazakumullah khairan, Profesor Faisal Ismail dan semuanya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.